This week's ASEAN summit comes amid renewed debate about the increasing assertiveness of China in its diplomacy and investment throughout the Pacific. Up until August, Liberal Senator Fierravanti-Wells was the Minister for International Development and the Pacific. She's been talking to political editor Andrew Probyn.
I'm very, very pleased, actually, that the Pacific is now geopolitically much more important, and I think is resonating a lot more in terms of where we stand internationally and in the foreign affairs spectrum. The reality is this is our neighbourhood, Andrew, and I strongly advocated as Minister that we should, that the Pacific should have greater precedence in our foreign policy, and indeed I strongly advocated for the Pacific to be one of our 5 priority areas in the foreign policy white paper.
China says that it is also its neighbourhood. What are your concerns when it comes to China?
Look, I think that certainly I made some frank and forthright comments earlier this year, particularly in relation to debt issues and debt sustainability. And I made those comments in the context of concerns that have been raised by academics, by commentators, by the IMF in relation to debt distress in the Pacific. We now see a situation where we have in the Pacific about $5.5 billion worth of debt, and about 1.5 billion of that is owed to China. Now, debt is debt, and debt needs to be repaid.
Are you suggesting that China goes into some of these into these arrangements thinking that the debt will be impossible to pay?
We haven't seen any indication that any of these debts are going to be forgiven, and indeed we are now seeing a situation, particularly in Tonga, where whilst debt repayment was delayed for a number of years, that debt has now become due and payable.
And a claim on equity. So it effectively means that China might own some of these.
Well, we don't know, Andrew. We don't know whether
some of... Is that what you're suggesting?
What I'm saying, Andrew, is that we do not know because, of course, China does not disclose data pertinent to its aid.
Where do you stand on shifting Australia's Israeli embassy to Jerusalem?
Well, I've been a supporter of this, and indeed a motion was recently passed at Federal Council to this effect.
Well, if Jakarta, as it seems, is unwilling to sign a free trade agreement with Australia until that notion is dropped, should we be shifting the embassy or pursuing the FTA if it's a choice between the two?
Well, I think, Andrew, last year we released a foreign policy white paper, and that foreign policy white paper professes to be a projection of our values and beliefs.
So pursue it?
Well, my point is that there comes a point, if you are going to profess to have a foreign policy white paper that says that your foreign policy is a projection of your values, then there comes a time when you have to stand up for your values and beliefs, even where there may be commercial interests involved, and that's a matter and that's a decision for Australia to ultimately make. But if you're going to profess to stand on a foreign policy platform where values and beliefs are important, then there comes a time when you have to stand for and stand up for those values and beliefs.
Your colleague Erica Betts says that Australia should rethink some of the foreign aid it gives to Indonesia if Jakarta is going to dictate, he says, foreign policy. Do you agree?
Well, we certainly reduced our overseas development assistance to Indonesia in the last budget, but that's a reflection very much of the changing relationship between Australia and Indonesia. And indeed, earlier this year, I attended the Australia-Indonesia dialogue, which is a second-track dialogue, and it's very clear that that relationship is changing. So some of those ODA needs that...
You're avoiding the question.
No, I'm just simply saying, Andrew, that there comes a time when you do consider ODA priorities, and this was I come back to the initial point that I made. I personally believe that we should be reprioritising our ODA to focus on the Pacific, which is where I think we can do the greatest need.
Now, lastly, you criticised Melissa Price today, the Environment Minister, calling her an L-plate minister. What was that about?
Well, basically it was in the context of my concerns about the fact that we've done some really good work, particularly in the climate space and climate action, and particularly in terms of disaster preparedness. And this is very much where I am focusing my commentary in relation to some of the announcements that have been made. And I made it in the context of saying that there is critical infrastructure in the Pacific, such as schools, community halls, hospitals, etc., which I believe should be the focus of our investment.
I think you accused her of lack of diplomacy, understanding and respect for one of our nearest neighbours.
I think what's really important in the Pacific, and my work in this area has told me that you can be frank and forthright, but at the same time be respectful and understanding of the Pacific way. And I think that in this area, Andrew, this is one of the most disaster-prone areas in the world. And so, therefore, disaster has affected the economic viability, the social cohesion, and many different aspects of life in the Pacific as a consequence of disaster after disaster. And so I think it's important for Australia to understand the impacts that this disaster have, not trivialise it, but at the same time respond in a practical way. But my article actually goes to the practical way that I think that not only what we've done in the past in terms of practical help and practical assistance, but what I'm suggesting that we should do in the future, particularly using some of the funds that have now been dedicated for the Pacific. I'm suggesting that we should deal with Pacific resilience, particularly by putting money into a Pacific Resilience Fund, which is the key priority for our Pacific neighbours.
All right, Senator, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Andrew.